The children who vanished from Fairhope Plantation. The plantation records tell a story that Charleston officials tried to erase for more than 100 years. Between 1843 and 1851, 17 children were born in the slave quarters of South Carolina plantations. Their skin was pale like cotton cloth left in the sun. Their eyes were blue or green like the shallow coastal waters. On paper, these children existed. Then suddenly, they did not. No death certificates. No sale records. No escape notices. By 1851, every single one of them had vanished from the official slave registries. They were not freed. They were not buried. They were transformed. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We uncover the darkest corners of American history, the stories that were hidden on purpose, the truths that make people uncomfortable. And after you finish this video, leave a comment telling us what state or city you are listening from. Every town has secrets. Some are just buried deeper than others. What happened at Fairhope Plantation did not begin with the children themselves. It began with silence. A silence so carefully maintained that generations learned never to speak about what they saw. Fairhope Plantation sat 23 miles northwest of Charleston, where the Ashley River curved through thick marshland. Tall cypress trees rose from black water. Spanish moss hung like tattered curtains from ancient live oaks. The land was fertile, dangerous, and perfect for rice cultivation. The main house stood on a small rise overlooking 300 acres of fields. It was a white two-story structure with wide galleries and 6 columns that gave it the appearance of calm order. But beneath that calm lived something rotten. By 1842, Fairhope was owned by the Colson family, one of the most respected names in the Lowcountry. The plantation held 47 enslaved people and had been operating for over 60 years without scandal. At least, without scandal that reached polite society. Thomas Colson inherited Fairhope at the age of 29 after his father died of yellow fever. Unlike many planters who preferred the comfort of Charleston townhouses, Thomas lived on the plantation year-round. His wife had died years earlier, giving birth to their only child, a daughter named Margaret. When Margaret turned 7, she was sent away to live with relatives in Virginia. Thomas never remarried. Neighbors described him as quiet and serious. He did not drink heavily. He did not gamble. He attended church and donated regularly. He was known for efficiency rather than cruelty, a reputation that made him respectable in white society and terrifying in ways that were harder to describe. His overseer, Duncan Hayes, had worked at Fairhope for 18 years. He believed order mattered more than violence. Not because he cared about the enslaved people, but because sick and broken workers did not produce good harvests. The slave quarters consisted of 14 small cabins built from tabby, a mixture of oyster shell, sand, and lime. They were cleaner than most quarters in the region. Rations were just enough to keep bodies working. Illness meant lost labor, and Thomas Colson did not tolerate inefficiency. Among the enslaved community lived a young woman named Raynor. In the summer of 1843, Raynor was 24 years old. She worked in the main house as a seamstress and sometimes served guests when company visited. She had been born at Fairhope, just like her mother and grandmother before her. Raynor had lighter skin than most field workers. Her eyes were hazel. Her hair fell in loose waves. These features were often praised in coded language, praised in ways that made her stomach twist. Her grandmother had been brought from Barbados decades earlier and carried mixed blood. That history lived in Raynor's face. She could read. An elderly white woman who once worked briefly as a tutor at Fairhope had secretly taught her letters before dying. Raynor kept that knowledge hidden. Literacy was dangerous. Knowledge was dangerous. In the spring of 1843, Raynor became pregnant. She never spoke of the father. Not to her mother. Not to her closest friend Ruth. When asked, she would turn away and keep working with her hands. The other women understood her silence. They had seen it before. There were things you did not name when there was no justice to protect you. Thomas Colson never acknowledged her condition. He never spoke her name differently. He simply reassigned her to lighter work late in the pregnancy, as if the child growing inside her was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. In December of 1843, Raynor gave birth. The midwife, a woman named Diana who had delivered dozens of babies at Fairhope, later told her husband that she nearly cried out when she first saw the child. The baby's skin was pale. Not light brown, not mixed, pale enough to pass as white in certain light. When the child opened her eyes 2 days later, they were blue. Raynor named her Lily. For 3 months, Rayner kept the baby hidden as much as possible, claiming Lily was sick and needed warmth. But secrets do not survive long in cramped quarters. Word spread. Whispers followed Rayner wherever she went. Some of the older women said the child was marked, that she would bring danger. Others saw Lily as proof of violence that had haunted them for generations. In March of 1844, Thomas Coulson saw Lily for the first time. Rayner had brought the child to the main house because no one could watch her that day. Thomas looked at the baby for a long moment. His face did not change. He said nothing. That night, he summoned Duncan Hayes. The two men met in Thomas's study until well past midnight. 3 weeks later, a stranger arrived at Fairhope Plantation. He introduced himself as Samuel Porter, a textile merchant from Columbia. He stayed 2 days. No fabric arrived. No orders were placed. Samuel Porter walked through the slave quarters one morning with Duncan Hayes at his side. He studied the children closely. Too closely. He took notes in a small leather journal. Mothers pulled their children closer. They did not know why. But they felt it. And somewhere between the marsh and the river, something ancient and cruel began to move. If this story has you hooked, make sure you subscribe, share this video with someone who loves dark history, and comment below where you are watching from. Part 2 reveals what Samuel Porter was really looking for, and why Fairhope Plantation would never be the same again. Part 2. The first child taken. Some crimes are loud, others are quiet enough to last forever. In the summer of 1844, a 6-month-old child vanished from Fairhope Plantation without a sound. No scream, no struggle, just an empty cradle and a silence so heavy it crushed the breath from the women who stood around it. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories history tried to erase. Share this video with someone who loves dark American history, and after you finish watching, leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. You may be closer to these secrets than you think. Before Samuel Porter left Fairhope Plantation, he spent an hour alone with Thomas Coulson in the study. The door was closed. The windows were shut despite the heat. When Samuel finally stepped back into the sunlight, he carried a sealed envelope and a promise that letters would follow. Lily was 6 months old when she disappeared. It happened in June of 1844 during a stretch of heat so thick the air felt glued in place. Even the insects moved slowly. Rayner woke before dawn and fed Lily like she did every morning. She changed the baby's clothes and laid her in the wooden cradle that had rocked generations of enslaved children. Ruth promised to check on Lily throughout the day. By mid-morning, Ruth entered the cabin and felt her heart drop. The cradle was there. The blanket was still warm. Lily was gone. Ruth ran from cabin to cabin asking if anyone had taken the baby outside. No one had seen her. Panic spread quickly, not wild panic, but the cold kind that comes when people already understand the truth. Ruth ran to the main house and found Rayner in the sewing room. The words came out broken and fast. The baby was gone. The cabin was empty. Rayner dropped the shirt in her hands and ran. By the time she reached the quarters, women were searching everywhere. Under beds, behind cabins, in storage sheds. They called Lily's name until their voices cracked. Within minutes, Duncan Hayes appeared and ordered a full search of the plantation. Men were pulled from the fields. The rice barns were searched. The woods were combed. The marshes were checked before dark. Lily was never found. That evening, Thomas Coulson spoke to Rayner only once. He stood on the back steps of the main house while she stood below him in the yard. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. He said every effort was being made. He suggested an animal might have taken the child. Foxes, alligators. He spoke calmly, like he was discussing the weather. Rayner knew better. There was no blood, no torn blanket, no sign of struggle. Lily had been lifted from her cradle by human hands. And Rayner knew those hands did not move on their own. She said nothing. Who would listen to an enslaved woman? What justice existed for her child? She returned to her cabin and closed the door. For 3 days, Rayner did not move. She stared at the empty cradle while her body still made milk for a child who would never return. The other women brought food she could not eat. They sat with her in silence. On the 4th day, Rayner rose before dawn, washed herself, and returned to work. Duncan Hayes asked if she was fit to labor. She said yes. She picked up her needle and mended Thomas Coulson's shirt with steady hands. She never spoke Lily's name again. Not out loud, not even in her thoughts. Because Lily had not died. She had been sold. 200 miles away in Columbia, South Carolina, a woman named Charlotte Brennan received a child she had been praying for. Charlotte and her husband Robert had been married 10 years without children. Robert was a lawyer who handled property disputes and estate matters for some of the most powerful families in the state. Adoption was complicated, dangerous, even. Then Robert's cousin Samuel Porter came with a solution. He knew of an infant girl. Orphaned, beautiful, healthy. The details were sensitive. Discretion was required. Charlotte asked few questions. 3 weeks later, a carriage arrived with a 6-month-old baby girl. Pale skin, blue eyes. They named her Sarah. They claimed she was the secret child of Robert's deceased brother. A quiet family tragedy. A sympathetic clerk accepted the story and filed falsified birth records. Money changed hands quietly. No receipts. No names. Lily ceased to exist. Over the next 7 years, 16 more children were born in the slave quarters of 5 different plantations across the South Carolina Lowcountry. Each child vanished. The plantations were miles apart. The mothers could not communicate. Each woman believed her grief was hers alone. But there was a pattern. Each plantation was wealthy. Each owner had connections in Charleston. Each used the same lawyer, Robert Brennan, and one overseer knew it all, Duncan Hayes. If this story chills you, subscribe now so you do not miss part 3. Share this video to keep these forgotten voices alive, and comment below with the name of your city or state. The next chapter reveals how Duncan Hayes became the silent keeper of a secret that could destroy South Carolina's most respected families. Part 3. The button beneath the floor. Some secrets survive because no one dares to speak them. Others survive because the people who know the truth are paid to forget it. By 1849, Duncan Hayes had learned the difference. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to this channel if you want the full story. Share this video with someone who loves dark American history, and leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. The next chapters only grow darker. As overseer of Fairhope Plantation, Duncan Hayes had watched Lily vanish and understood exactly what had happened to her. Over the following years, as he traveled between plantations on business for Thomas Colson, he began to hear the same whispers repeated in different places. A baby gone in the night. A mother left with nothing. A white visitor arriving shortly before the disappearance. Hayes listened carefully. He asked questions when it was safe. He remembered names. At night, in his small room, he wrote everything down in a journal he hid beneath a loose floorboard. Hayes was not driven by guilt. He had overseen enslaved labor for 23 years and had long ago accepted the cruelty of the system. His interest was practical. He believed he was witnessing something new. By 1849, his journal contained 9 detailed accounts. Dates, plantation names, descriptions of the children, and certain names appeared again and again. Samuel Porter, Robert Brennan, Dr. Horace Strickland. In December of that year, a 10th child was born at Fairhope Plantation. The mother was a woman named Catherine who worked in the kitchen. She never spoke about how she became pregnant. No one asked. Her son was born with pale skin and clear blue eyes. She named him Joseph. Catherine knew immediately what that meant. The story of Rayner's child had never been spoken openly, but it lived in whispers. Catherine understood that Joseph would be taken. She also knew she could not stop it. But Catherine refused to suffer quietly. 2 weeks before Joseph disappeared, she found Duncan Hayes near the rice barns in the fading evening light. What she did next could have destroyed her. She spoke first. She told Hayes she knew what was going to happen. She told him she knew he kept records. She told him he knew where the children went. Then she made a request. She did not ask for her son back. She knew that was impossible. She asked for proof. Something that belonged to Joseph. Something that would tell her he had lived. Hayes stared at her. No enslaved woman had ever spoken to him like that. The correct response would have been punishment. Instead, he nodded once and walked away. 3 weeks later, Joseph vanished from his cradle. Catherine did not cry. She did not search. She returned to the kitchen and worked as if nothing had happened. 1 week later, she found a small wooden button near the doorway of her cabin. It was finely carved, too fine for enslaved clothing. She recognized it instantly. She had sewn it onto Joseph's tiny shirt using scraps from the main house. Catherine hid the button inside the wall of her cabin. It was not her child. But it was proof. Joseph had existed. Duncan Hayes never spoke to Catherine again about what he had done. But the act mattered. It was the first crack in the system. Not justice. Not mercy, just recognition. Between 1850 and 1851, 6 more children were born and disappeared. The network had grown efficient. Babies were taken earlier. Paperwork moved faster. More clerks were paid. More officials looked away. Robert Brennan had established buyers across South Carolina and Georgia. Couples paid between $800 and $1,500 for a child who could pass as white. Samuel Porter handled transport and timing. Dr. Horace Strickland created medical records and false birth certificates. 17 children passed through this system. They grew up in white homes. They learned to read. They attended school. They lived lives stolen from their mothers. They never knew the truth. The enslaved women did. They carried a grief that had no grave, no funeral, no ending. But the machine that erased these children was about to break. And it would begin with betrayal. Subscribe now so you do not miss part 4. Share this story so these voices are not lost again. And comment below with your city or state. The next chapter reveals who turned against the network and why the truth could no longer stay buried. Part 4. The secret that could not stay hidden. Some secrets are too big to be contained. Some crimes are too cruel to remain in the shadows forever. By 1852, the network that had stolen 17 children across South Carolina was operating like a well-oiled machine. Each step was planned. Each participant had a role. Samuel Porter identified the infants. Robert Brennan arranged the buyers. Dr. Horace Strickland fabricated the medical records. Duncan Hayes kept the overseer's journal, recording each disappearance with meticulous care. But even the most precise system can fail. Before we dive deeper, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who is fascinated by dark chapters of American history. And comment below where you are watching from. The next chapter uncovers betrayal that shook the foundations of this secret world. It began at a small plantation near Beaufort. The owner, a man known for his hospitality and respectability, had long trusted Robert Brennan to handle family legal matters. In the spring of 1852, a child was born there with pale skin and eyes like sea glass. The mother, a woman named Lillian, had been warned by others in the quarters. She knew what would happen. Unlike some of the women who came before her, Lillian made a plan. She watched. She memorized faces. She remembered carriage routes and the times men arrived and left. She had no hope of saving her child, but she could leave evidence. Something concrete, something the world might see if the truth ever came out. Samuel Porter arrived as usual. Polite, quiet, with a small notebook in his pocket. He examined the baby and nodded at the plantation owner. Robert Brennan arrived the next morning to prepare the legal paperwork. Dr. Strickland signed the medical forms. The baby would be gone before nightfall. But Lillian had been careful. She had sewn a tiny silver pendant into the hem of the infant's blanket. Engraved in tiny letters was her name and the plantation where she was born. If anyone ever found it, they would know the truth. That night, the baby vanished as the others had. No one heard a cry. No one saw the carriage that carried the child to a new life. But the pendant remained hidden, a tiny, almost invisible record of the crime. Word traveled slowly among the quarters, carried in whispers and coded songs. Mothers shared the stories carefully, never using names, never revealing the full truth. The pattern was becoming clear. Every child with pale skin born in the quarters of a plantation near Charleston could be taken, transformed, and erased from the world of the enslaved. Duncan Hayes, meanwhile, continued to watch. He had long since learned to separate guilt from observation. He noted the new disappearance in his journal and added it to the growing collection of secrets buried beneath the floorboards of his room. But there was a shift in him. The act of hiding proof, the quiet resistance of mothers like Catherine and Lillian, began to gnaw at him. He had seen the fear and grief in their faces. He had watched the despair that followed each disappearance. For the first time, the system he served with loyalty felt fragile. The buyers, white families desperate for children, began to notice a problem too. One child arrived with an item that should not have been there. A small pendant with engraved letters. When they asked Samuel Porter about it, he dismissed it as a harmless mistake, but the careful lie unsettled the receiving family. Meanwhile, the network grew bolder. They had been operating with near impunity for nearly a decade. Wealthy couples, convinced of their own innocence because they had been told they were helping an orphan, were increasingly careless. They boasted of the children, showed them to neighbors, and spoke of them publicly, forgetting the danger of the truth. Catherine's button, Lily's faint memory, Lillian's pendant, small cracks were forming. Objects, memories, tokens that could not be erased were scattered across the South. They were evidence of a crime so vast, so carefully hidden, that the enslaved women had learned to carry their grief silently. At Fairhope Plantation, Thomas Colson remained unmoved. He did not notice the growing unease. He continued to live in quiet efficiency, satisfied that the children had been delivered into good homes and that the records were complete. He believed the secret was unbreakable. But Duncan Hayes felt it. A tension he could not ignore. The mothers, the women who had suffered in silence, were not entirely powerless. Their small acts of defiance were like faint sparks in a dark room. Each spark threatened to ignite the carefully controlled world the network had built. By the summer of 1852, the network was beginning to notice mistakes of its own. Samuel Porter received letters from families that questioned minor details. Robert Brennan had to smooth over concerns from clerks who had been offered bribes but were increasingly nervous. Dr. Strickland faced inquiries about inconsistencies in his medical forms. And the mothers were watching. Each child vanished with care, but each child left a mark, a trace, a secret object, a hidden message. They were small, almost invisible, but they were there. Tokens of life that could not be denied. The tension reached Fairhope Plantation when Duncan Hayes discovered that Catherine's button had been removed from its hiding place. Someone had found it. Someone was paying attention. Hayes knew immediately that the fragile balance of secrecy was under threat. The network that had seemed invincible for nearly a decade had begun to fracture. The mothers, grief and courage, the children's silent traces, the small tokens hidden in plain sight, they were becoming a force the system could not control. And yet, for every crack, the machinery continued. New children would be born. New disappearances would happen. The system adapted, it persisted, but the undercurrent of resistance was growing stronger, feeding on hope, and threatening to expose everything. If you want to know what happens next, subscribe now so you do not miss part 5. Share this story to keep these hidden histories alive. And comment below telling us the state or city you are listening from. In part 5, the network begins to unravel, and a new player appears who may change everything. If you want, I can continue with part 5 next, making the story even more suspenseful as the network starts to unravel and the first hints of exposure appear. Do you want me to do that? Part 5, the network begins to fracture. Some secrets are too big to last forever. Some crimes are so carefully hidden that even those who enforce them cannot ignore the cracks. By 1853, the network that had stolen 17 children across South Carolina was beginning to show signs of weakness. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who loves dark and forgotten stories from American history. And leave a comment below telling us where you are listening from. The story only grows darker from here. Duncan Hayes had watched nearly a decade of disappearances. He had recorded them all in his journal hidden beneath the floorboards of his quarters. Lily, Joseph, the 6 children born between 1850 and 1851, and now new cases across neighboring plantations. Each had vanished with the same careful precision. Each had left mothers in silent grief. But the women were no longer entirely silent. Catherine had left the button. Lillian had sewn the tiny silver pendant into her child's blanket. Small acts, almost invisible, but they were enough to make the network uneasy. Samuel Porter noticed first. A minor detail reported by a buyer did not match his records. A family mentioned a pendant they did not understand. When he investigated, he found a trace of handwriting in the hem of a blanket that should have been smooth and empty. Robert Brennan began to grow nervous as well. Clerks who had filed falsified birth records were asking questions. Some were worried that the law might one day catch up to them. Others whispered that the children were more than orphans, they were evidence of a crime. Dr. Horace Strickland faced new questions too. One family had asked why the vaccination records for a child did not match their age. Small discrepancies were appearing in documents that had always been flawless. The doctor had to cover each one carefully, but it was clear the system was starting to falter. Meanwhile, Duncan Hayes was becoming increasingly uneasy. He had never felt loyalty to the children's mothers, but the repeated evidence of their clever resistance unsettled him. Each hidden button, each small token, was a sign that the women had not forgotten, that the system was not perfect, that someone might one day expose everything. And then came the first real betrayal from within the network. A clerk in Columbia who had been quietly accepting bribes from Robert Brennan began speaking to a cousin. He did not know the cousin would share the story with another family in Charleston. By the summer of 1853, small pieces of the truth were moving in ways no one had intended. At Fairhope Plantation, Hayes noticed a change in Thomas Colson. The master remained calm, efficient, but subtle signs showed that even he felt unease. Letters arrived from families who had received children. Questions were asked about birth dates and origins. Even the polite inquiries from wealthy couples were enough to shake confidence in the system. Catherine had long ago accepted that Joseph would never return. She had hidden the button and said nothing. But now she heard whispers in the quarters of other mothers taking similar precautions. A small network of women, quietly resisting, was forming. They shared coded warnings and advice without speaking openly. Hayes began to realize the danger. The network depended on silence. Once someone began to leave evidence, the careful machine could falter. Each token, each subtle message, was a thread that could unravel the whole operation. In the spring, a child born at a plantation near Georgetown had a tiny note sewn into her blanket. The note included her name and the plantation she came from. Hayes found it when he checked the nursery before the child was scheduled to leave. He hid it, but the knowledge that someone was actively resisting. Not at him. Samuel Porter grew frustrated. He could no longer assume that all mothers would comply with the plan. A single mistake could expose years of careful work. Robert Brennan doubled payments to officials to ensure compliance. Dr. Strickland fabricated records faster and with more attention to detail. But cracks continued to appear. The mother's resistance was subtle, almost invisible, but it was enough to plant doubt. The network had been designed to run with precision, but precision could not overcome human ingenuity. The enslaved women had found ways to create evidence that the children existed, that they had been taken, that the system was not perfect. Hayes began to wonder if he was complicit in a crime that could one day destroy him. He had hidden the journal to protect himself, but now it felt like a dangerous liability. The women, with their hidden buttons, notes, and pendants, were creating a record that could, one day, surface. And then came the first serious threat from outside the network. A traveler from Charleston, passing through the plantations, overheard a coded warning sung quietly by one of the women. He reported it to a local magistrate. Nothing immediate happened, but the message had reached ears beyond the enslaved quarters for the first time in years. The tension in South Carolina was growing. Families who had once accepted children without question were now uncertain. Officials who had been bribed were hesitant. And Hayes, who had once trusted in silence and compliance, felt a growing weight of responsibility. It was the first time the network had shown weakness. The carefully hidden machinery of disappearances, bribes, and falsified documents was beginning to fracture. Small acts of courage, simple tokens of proof, had started to break the system. If you want to know what happens next, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss part 6. Share this story with friends to keep these forgotten histories alive. And comment below telling us your city or state. In part 6, the network begins to collapse as more evidence comes to light, and the first serious consequences for those involved appear. If you want, I can immediately continue with part 6, where the network starts to collapse and tension builds toward exposure, keeping the story chilling and suspenseful for your YouTube audience. Do you want me to do that next? Part 6. The first cracks of exposure. Some truths refuse to stay buried. Some crimes, no matter how carefully hidden, demand to be seen. By 1854, the network that had stolen 17 children across South Carolina was beginning to crumble, and the first cracks of exposure were forming. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who loves dark and forgotten chapters of American history. And leave a comment below telling us the state or city you are watching from. The story is about to take a terrifying turn. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A child born at a plantation near Georgetown had been taken by Samuel Porter and delivered to a wealthy family in Charleston. Everything seemed normal until the mother of the child left a small token sewn into the blanket. A tiny silver pendant, engraved with her name and the plantation where the child had been born. When the family discovered it weeks later, they were unsettled. They had been told the child was an orphan with no origins, but now a small piece of evidence suggested otherwise. Samuel Porter was furious. How could this happen? How could a single mother, a woman without power, leave a trace that might expose the entire network? Meanwhile, Duncan Hayes was watching the plantation quarters more closely than ever. He had been an observer for years, documenting each disappearance in his journal hidden beneath the floorboards. Now he felt a growing unease. The women were no longer silent. They were leaving evidence, sending messages, and refusing to be erased. Catherine's button, Lillian's pendant, and now the new tokens from other plantations were creating a hidden record of a crime that stretched across the Lowcountry. Hayes knew that if any of it was discovered, everyone involved would face consequences. Robert Brennan sensed it too. Families who had previously accepted children without question were beginning to ask about details. Some were suspicious of inconsistencies in birth records. Others were unsettled by subtle hints that the children were not entirely orphans. The careful machine that had taken 17 children and erased their origins was starting to show weakness. Dr. Horace Strickland found himself under pressure as well. One family questioned why a child's vaccination records did not match their expected age. Another asked why a child had a tiny pendant sewn into a blanket that did not belong to the family. Strickland had to cover every detail carefully, but he realized that mistakes were accumulating. At Fairhope Plantation, Thomas Colson remained outwardly calm. He continued his work with the rice fields and managed his household efficiently, but Hayes noticed subtle signs of tension in the man. Letters arrived from families who had received children, and even polite inquiries about origins made Colson uneasy. The enslaved women in the quarters were emboldened. Catherine had passed the story of Lily to younger women in coded warnings. Lillian had instructed others to leave tokens in blankets and clothing. These small acts of defiance were invisible to most, but they were dangerous. The first serious threat from outside the network emerged when a traveler passing through Plantations overheard a coded song warning of the disappearances. He reported it to a magistrate in Charleston. No immediate action was taken, but for the first time, the secret of the children's abduction had reached ears beyond the quarters. Hayes understood that the network depended on silence. Once mothers began leaving evidence, the careful structure could fracture. Each token, each small note, was a thread that could unravel the system. By the summer of 1854, the network was in disarray. Samuel Porter grew frustrated with each new token discovered. Robert Brennan doubled his bribes to clerks and officials to prevent questions from being asked. Dr. Strickland worked frantically to maintain false records, but the errors were growing too frequent to ignore. At the same time, the mothers' bravery increased. They no longer acted purely in secrecy. Some whispered to trusted neighbors. Others left hidden messages for their children, small clues that might one day lead them back to their origins. The evidence was multiplying. Hayes began to realize the danger of his own journal. He had been keeping records for his own protection, but now it was a liability. If discovered, it could reveal the entire system. The very tool he had used to survive years of complicity could also destroy him. The tension reached its peak when Samuel Porter received a letter from a buyer questioning inconsistencies in a child's history. This was the first serious challenge the network had faced. The buyers had always trusted Porter, Brennan, and Strickland completely. Now doubt had entered their world. For the enslaved women, this was a small victory. Their children remained hidden in white homes, but the system that had stolen them was no longer infallible. They had created a silent rebellion, a web of proof that could one day expose the truth. And so, the machine that had stolen 17 children across South Carolina began to crumble. Small acts of courage, invisible to most, were enough to create cracks in a system that had seemed unbreakable. If you want to know what happens next, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss part 7. Share this story with friends to honor the memories of those stolen children. And comment below telling us your state or city. In part 7, the network begins to collapse completely as the consequences of exposure draw closer, and the first real justice may appear. I can now create part 7, where the network starts collapsing entirely, and the tension peaks with secrets being revealed and real danger for those involved. Do you want me to continue with part 7 next? Part 7. The network begins to collapse. Some secrets cannot survive the truth forever. Some crimes, no matter how carefully hidden, have a way of unraveling from the smallest thread. By 1855, the network that had stolen 17 children across South Carolina was beginning to collapse. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who wants to explore dark corners of American history. And comment below telling us where you are watching from. The story is about to reach a terrifying turning point. The first cracks had appeared quietly. A tiny silver pendant here, a hidden note there, small tokens of proof that mothers had left in secret. These were almost invisible acts, but they were growing into a pattern that even the powerful could no longer ignore. Samuel Porter felt it first. The families who had bought children were asking questions. Some wanted details of the child's birth. Others mentioned odd tokens they had found in clothing. Every question, no matter how small, created pressure. Porter had always controlled the network with quiet precision, but now uncertainty crept into his work. Robert Brennan was anxious. Clerks who had once quietly accepted bribes were now hesitating. They asked questions about documents, birth dates, and vaccination records. One clerk even hinted that he feared the law might one day demand answers. Brennan tried to calm him, to silence him, but the cracks in the system could no longer be ignored. Dr. Horace Strickland felt it as well. His falsified medical records, once flawless, were now scrutinized. Parents asked about small details that did not add up. In one instance, a child had a mark on the skin that was not on any medical record. The doctor fabricated explanations, but with each lie, the tension grew. At Fairhope Plantation, Thomas Colson continued to act as if nothing had changed. He managed his rice fields, oversaw his household, and maintained the appearance of calm. But Hayes noticed subtle signs of unease. Letters arrived from families who had received children, asking for explanations. Even polite inquiries carried weight, suggesting suspicion and doubt. The enslaved women in the quarters were emboldened. Catherine, Lillian, Rayner, and others had long since learned the power of leaving evidence. They shared secret warnings and instructions in whispers, making sure that every child taken left a trace. Buttons, pendants, and small notes became invisible records of the crime that could not be erased. Hayes realized the danger of his own journal. Hidden beneath the floorboards for years, it contained meticulous details of each disappearance. Once a single token or letter was discovered, his journal could reveal the entire network. The system he had once trusted to protect him was now a liability. The first real threat to the network came from outside. A visitor from Charleston, passing through Plantations, overheard a coded warning sung in a song by one of the women. He reported it to a local magistrate. The law had never intervened before, but now someone beyond the quarters knew something was wrong. Samuel Porter tried to maintain control. He traveled between plantations, checking on each child, reminding families to keep quiet, and ensuring that no evidence became public. He grew frustrated as he encountered tokens, questions, and suspicion at every turn. The system he had relied on for nearly a decade was failing. Robert Brennan attempted to contain the problem with bribes. Officials and clerks were compensated for silence, but some hesitated, fearful of the growing unease. The careful structure of disappearances, falsified documents, and secret sales could no longer operate with confidence. The enslaved women's resistance grew bolder. Each child that disappeared left a mark, a token, a trace that could be found one day. Mothers who had long accepted grief in silence began to act with courage. They communicated through coded warnings, hidden objects, and whispered stories that survived from one generation to the next. Hayes knew the system was fragile. The network depended on silence and compliance. Now, evidence of resistance was appearing in nearly every corner. Small cracks had turned into gaps, and the machinery of abduction could no longer function without fear of exposure. The tension reached a climax at a plantation near Beaufort. A family receiving a child discovered a hidden silver pendant and a folded note with the child's original name and birthplace. The family confronted Samuel Porter. He could not lie convincingly. For the first time, his authority was questioned. At the same time, Catherine and other mothers learned that tokens left by Lillian had been discovered by plantation workers. These small victories, almost invisible, were signs that the network was no longer unbreakable. Hayes felt the first true fear of exposure in his years of service. The children remained in white homes, their lives continuing as if nothing had changed, but the network that had stolen them was cracking. Samuel Porter, Robert Brennan, and Dr. Strickland realized that their careful system, once so reliable, was now vulnerable. Every hidden token, every whispered story, and every small act of resistance threatened to unravel a decade of crimes. For the first time, the mothers had hope. Though they could not bring back their children, they were leaving proof, and proof could lead to justice. The network that had seemed invincible was starting to collapse, not because of outside intervention alone, but because of the courage and cunning of those who had been silenced for so long. If you want to know what happens next, Subscribe to this channel so you do not miss part 8. Share this story with friends to honor the memories of the children who were taken. And comment below telling us your city or state. In part 8, the collapse accelerates, secrets are revealed, and those responsible begin to face consequences. I can now create part 8, where the network falls further apart and the first confrontations with the truth occur, heightening suspense for your YouTube audience. Do you want me to continue with part 8 next? Part 8. The secrets start to surface. Some lies are too big to last forever. Some crimes, no matter how carefully hidden, leave traces that refuse to stay buried. By 1856, the network that had stolen 17 children across South Carolina was beginning to unravel, and secrets long hidden were starting to surface. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who wants to explore forgotten and haunting chapters of American history. And leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. The story is about to reach a shocking turning point. It began quietly. A child born at a plantation near Beaufort had been delivered to a wealthy family in Charleston. The family discovered a small note hidden in the child's clothing, a note that included the original name of the child and the plantation she came from. They confronted Samuel Porter. For the first time in over a decade, his authority was questioned. The news spread slowly at first. Families who had received children began comparing details. Some noticed small discrepancies in birth records. Others mentioned tokens, pendants, or notes they had discovered. Every discovery was a tiny crack in a system that had once seemed flawless. At Fairhope Plantation, Duncan Hayes felt the tension more than anyone. He had kept meticulous records in his hidden journal, documenting each disappearance, each transaction, and each child's physical features. Now, those records could become evidence of crimes he had helped facilitate. The system he had relied on for safety was crumbling. The enslaved women in the quarters were emboldened. Catherine, Lillian, and others had long been leaving tokens of proof. Now they realized their efforts were making a difference. Each hidden object, each small note, was evidence that could one day reach the children themselves. It was a form of resistance that no one could punish or erase. Samuel Porter grew desperate. He traveled between plantations, trying to intercept notes, remove tokens, and reassure families. But the resistance was organized. Women had begun sharing strategies in coded whispers, warning each other of potential inspections and keeping evidence hidden in plain sight. Robert Brennan felt the first real fear of exposure. Clerks and officials who had once accepted bribes now hesitated. Some refused to falsify documents further. Others quietly suggested that the transactions were illegal and dangerous. The system that had operated with impunity for years was now fragile. Dr. Horace Strickland faced growing scrutiny as well. Families asked questions about medical records, vaccination histories, and inconsistencies in ages. In one case, a child had a small scar that did not appear on any record. Strickland attempted to fabricate explanations, but the number of discrepancies was increasing. At a plantation near Georgetown, a mother had sewn a note into a blanket with details of her child's birth and plantation. That blanket reached a white family unaware of its hidden message. When the note was discovered, the family contacted Samuel Porter, demanding answers. For the first time, Porter could not provide a satisfactory explanation. The network was unraveling from within and without. Mothers, using cunning and courage, were leaving evidence that threatened to expose the truth. Clerks, families, and officials were beginning to question the legitimacy of the system. Every discovery weakened the carefully constructed web of secrecy. Hayes felt the weight of responsibility. He had spent years documenting disappearances, and now his hidden journal might become the key to exposing the entire network. For the first time, he feared not just discovery but also retribution from those involved in orchestrating the disappearances. The children themselves remained unaware. Lily, now living as Sarah Brennan, played piano in her well-appointed home. Joseph and the others attended school and lived the lives of children who had never known the truth. Yet the hidden tokens left behind were slowly connecting their past to their present. Samuel Porter became more ruthless. He attempted to intimidate families, bribe officials, and erase evidence. But the resistance had grown too strong. Mothers were leaving multiple tokens in different places. Notes, pendants, and buttons were hidden in clothing, bedding, and toys. Each act was small, but together they formed a record that could not be ignored. At Fairhope Plantation, Hayes realized that the network would not survive much longer. The system relied on silence, secrecy, and fear. Now silence had been broken. Small acts of courage had created cracks that were growing wider by the day. By late 1856, the first real consequences began to appear. A family in Charleston contacted authorities about the inconsistencies in a child's records. Clerks were questioned. Dr. Strickland faced scrutiny for falsifying medical documents. Samuel Porter's reputation began to crumble, and Robert Brennan feared that exposure was imminent. The enslaved women, while still powerless to reclaim their children, had won a moral victory. Their small tokens of proof had begun to force the truth into the open. The network that had stolen 17 children across South Carolina was no longer untouchable. Hayes knew the danger was only beginning. The network was unraveling, and the consequences for those responsible were about to arrive. The secrets that had been carefully hidden for more than a decade could no longer remain buried. If you want to know what happens next, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss part 9. Share this story to honor the courage of the mothers who resisted in secret. And comment below telling us your city or state. In part 9, the collapse accelerates, and the first shocking revelations change everything for the families involved. I can now create part 9, where the full collapse occurs, evidence surfaces publicly, and the tension reaches its darkest and most dramatic point for your YouTube audience. Do you want me to continue with part 9 next? Part 9. The truth comes to light. Some secrets are too heavy to carry forever. Some lies, no matter how carefully constructed, collapse when the truth finds a way in. By 1857, the network that had stolen 17 children across South Carolina was finally unraveling, and the consequences would shake families, plantations, and the city of Charleston itself. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who wants to uncover hidden truths in American history. And comment below telling us the state or city you are watching from. The shocking revelations are about to begin. It started with a single note. Hidden in a blanket, sewn into a lining, were the details of a child's birth. The mother had risked everything to leave proof. When the White family discovered it, they contacted Samuel Porter. But this time, the explanation could not satisfy them. Questions turned into demands, and demands into fear. Samuel Porter's confidence faltered. The families had long trusted him completely. Now his authority was questioned. One parent demanded to know the truth. Another threatened to contact authorities. Porter realized that for the first time, the carefully maintained secrecy that had ruled the Lowcountry for over a decade was in danger. At Fairhope Plantation, Hayes felt a mixture of dread and relief. The journal he had hidden beneath the floorboards now held the key to understanding the full extent of the network. He knew the names, the dates, the children, and the people involved. But if discovered, the evidence could destroy everyone connected to the operation. The enslaved women had become bold. Catherine, Lillian, and others continued leaving tokens of proof, but now they also shared stories in whispers with each other. Their children's existence, hidden for years, could now become known. They had created a quiet rebellion that was breaking the system from within. Robert Brennan tried to maintain control. He doubled payments to clerks, pressured families, and demanded absolute loyalty. But the cracks had grown too wide. Clerks whispered to each other, questioning the legality of falsifying birth records. Some families refused to accept children under false pretenses. Dr. Horace Strickland was under mounting scrutiny. Small errors in medical documents, tiny inconsistencies in vaccination records, and questions from parents had made it impossible for him to maintain the facade. His meticulous records, once foolproof, were now evidence of manipulation and deception. The first public exposure occurred in Charleston. A newspaper, tipped off by a concerned citizen, published a story about mysterious adoptions and missing children. Details were vague, but enough was revealed to raise questions about wealthy families and plantation networks. Social circles that had once relied on appearances began to murmur and gossip. Hayes watched as the system he had been part of trembled. Samuel Porter tried to contain the panic, traveling from plantation to plantation, but he could not prevent the ripple effect. Families were confused, frightened, and angry. Clerks and officials were hesitant, unsure of whom to trust. The mothers' small acts of defiance became evidence of a larger truth. Tokens, pendants, buttons, and hidden notes were collected by Hayes and other allies. Each piece told a story, revealing the scope of the network, the identities of the children, and the families who had taken them. At Fairhope, Thomas Coulson grew tense. The letters and inquiries that had once been manageable now became relentless. Even the most loyal overseers and household staff began to question their involvement. The once perfect system of silence and secrecy was crumbling before their eyes. The children remained unaware of their origins. Sarah Brennan played piano, Joseph learned arithmetic, and the younger children attended school, living the lives of white children without knowledge of where they had come from. Yet the evidence was mounting, and the walls that had hidden their true identities were beginning to fall. Samuel Porter became desperate. He attempted to bribe newspapers, intimidate families, and destroy documents. But the mothers, resistance, Hayes' meticulous records, and the growing scrutiny from the public could no longer be silenced. The network that had stolen 17 children was being revealed piece by piece. Robert Brennan and Dr. Strickland faced the reality that exposure was inevitable. Their carefully constructed lies, falsified records, and bribed officials could not protect them. The society that had once turned a blind eye to their actions now demanded answers, and the pressure was inescapable. The enslaved women, though powerless to reclaim their children immediately, felt a sense of victory. Their acts of courage and cunning had forced the truth into the open. They had left evidence that could one day reunite children with their origins and expose those responsible for decades of theft and deception. By the end of 1857, the network was in chaos. Samuel Porter's authority had collapsed, Robert Brennan faced suspicion and potential legal consequences, and Dr. Strickland could no longer maintain his false records. The children remained in white homes, but the carefully hidden crimes that had taken them were now known to the world. If you want to know how this story ends, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss part 10. Share this story to honor the courage of the mothers who resisted in secret. And comment below telling us your city or state. In part 10, the final truths are revealed, justice confronts the powerful, and the fate of the stolen children is revealed. I can now create part 10, the final installment, where the truth is fully exposed, justice reaches those responsible, and the ultimate fate of the children is revealed in a gripping conclusion. Do you want me to continue with part 10 next? Part 10, the truth and justice. Some secrets refuse to die. Some crimes, no matter how carefully hidden, eventually meet the light. By 1858, the network that had stolen 17 children across South Carolina could no longer survive in the shadows. The truth was out, and the people responsible were about to face the consequences of their actions. Before we begin, subscribe to this channel to follow this story from start to finish. Share this video with someone who wants to uncover hidden chapters of American history. And comment below telling us where you are watching from. The shocking conclusion is about to be revealed. The first cracks had started years earlier, small acts of resistance by mothers determined to leave proof. Hidden buttons, pendants, folded notes, and secret warnings had slowly accumulated. Duncan Hayes' meticulous journal, once a private record, now became a key piece of evidence. Every disappearance, every transaction, every child was documented in painstaking detail. Samuel Porter, once untouchable, now faced scrutiny from every direction. Families who had received children demanded explanations. Some began questioning legal records. Clerks and officials hesitated to falsify documents further. Dr. Horace Strickland could no longer hide the inconsistencies in his medical records. Even Robert Brennan, the mastermind behind many of the transactions, felt the weight of exposure pressing on him. The enslaved women had kept hope alive through courage and cunning. Catherine, Lillian, and Rayner had left countless small tokens of proof. They had risked punishment, even death, to ensure that the truth could survive. Now, their careful efforts began to pay off. The society that had ignored their grief could no longer dismiss the evidence. In Charleston, newspapers began reporting on mysterious disappearances, hidden adoptions, and unexplained wealth among families who had received children. The public was scandalized. Social circles that had relied on appearances began to murmur in fear and suspicion. Rumors spread, and soon the story could no longer be ignored. Authorities began questioning families, clerks, and plantation owners. Some officials, long complicit through bribes or fear, were forced to testify. Others refused to cooperate, but the growing mountain of evidence made obstruction impossible. Each act of defiance by the mothers and hidden tokens left behind was now a weapon against the system. The children themselves remained unaware of their true origins. Lily, now Sarah Brennan, played piano in her well-appointed home. Joseph learned arithmetic and Latin. The younger children attended school and lived the lives of white children. Yet the traces of their past, once hidden, were now surfacing. Tokens left by their mothers and Hayes' journal connected them to the plantations and the women who had given them life. Samuel Porter attempted to flee, but he was tracked down. Robert Brennan faced legal consequences, his reputation shattered. Dr. Strickland was stripped of his license, his lies exposed. The system that had stolen 17 children for over a decade was finally dismantled. Justice, though delayed, had arrived. The enslaved mothers, though powerless to reclaim all their children immediately, had achieved something profound. They had ensured that the truth could not be erased. Each token, note, and pendant left behind became a bridge between stolen lives and stolen identities. The courage of those who had suffered in silence created a path for justice and recognition. Reunions were complicated but miraculous. Some children, now adults, learned the truth of their birth. Letters and tokens were carefully delivered, connecting them to mothers they had never known. Tears were shed, questions were asked, and memories returned in fragments. The stolen children were alive, and they had stories to tell. At Fairhope Plantation, the echoes of past crimes lingered. Thomas Colson had long passed, but Hayes continued to guard the journal that had revealed the network. The plantation, once a place of quiet horror, became a reminder of both cruelty and courage. The story of the stolen children lived on, a warning of how greed and power can corrupt, and how determination and bravery can restore what was taken. The final lesson was clear. The system that tried to erase lives and rewrite history could not prevail against truth. The mothers, the hidden allies, and even the cautious oversight of one man had ensured that the story would be told. The stolen children, now recognized, carried both the weight of history and the power of survival. If you want to remember the courage of those who resisted in secret, subscribe to this channel. Share this story with friends to honor the mothers who risked everything. Comment below telling us your city or state. History can be dark, but it is our duty to uncover it, remember it, and share it. The 17 children, once lost to secrecy, were now part of history. Their mothers' quiet acts of defiance had toppled a system built on lies. The truth had survived, justice had arrived, and the world could no longer ignore what happened in the Lowcountry plantations. The story ends here, but the echoes remain. Remember Lily, Joseph, and all the children who vanished only to live in secret. Remember Catherine, Rayner, and the brave women who ensured that history could not be rewritten. And remember that even the smallest act of courage can change the course of generations.